I've decided to put the house in Monica's name. Those words hit me harder than any fall I'd ever taken in the workshop, harder than the years of hammering nails into oak beams and sanding pine boards until my hands blistered. Ethan didn't even look at me when he said it. He stood by the kitchen sink, staring out at the garden, where his mother once planted roses, as if avoiding my eyes would soften the blow. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. For a long moment, I just sat at the kitchen table staring at the faded checkered cloth that had been there since my wife passed. The house smelled faintly of sawdust and coffee, two things that had defined my life. It wasn't just lumber and nails that built this home. It was the sound of my late wife humming hymns on Sunday mornings, the echoes of Ethan's laughter bouncing down the hallway, the marks on the doorframe where I measured his height every birthday. And now my only son was telling me it belonged to his wife. I didn't shout, I didn't pound the table, my chest tightened, and for a moment I thought about saying over my dead body. But instead I let the silence stretch until it wrapped around us both like a heavy quilt. Silence has a weight of its own, heavier than anger sometimes. Ethan cleared his throat, still not meeting my eyes. It makes sense, Dad. She's been the one keeping things organized. The bills, the plans for the future. She deserves to feel secure. Secure. That word cut deep. I had spent 70 years building security brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck. I hadn't missed a mortgage payment not once. Even when my back screamed after 12-hour shifts in the carpentry shop, I found a way to keep this roof over our heads. And now with one sentence, my son told me that security belonged to someone else. I looked at him then. His hair was thinner than I remembered, lines carving deeper around his eyes, but he still carried himself like the boy who thought he had all the answers. Ethan, I said quietly, this house is the only thing left that has my name on it. Your mother and I, we built our life here. Finally, he turned, and for a brief second I saw hesitation flicker in his eyes. But then Monica's voice cut through from the living room. Ethan, we don't need to explain. It's the right move. She stepped into the kitchen, her heels clicking against the old oak floor I'd laid with my own hands 40 years ago. Monica always dressed sharp, even on a Saturday. Her blazer was cream-colored, her nails perfectly manicured. She carried herself like someone who believed the world owed her respect. Harold, she said with a smile too sweet to be honest, don't take it personally. It's just paperwork. You'll still live here, of course. Nothing changes. Nothing changes. Except everything did. I didn't argue. I've learned in my years that sometimes words waste themselves on people who've already decided you're a relic. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, folded my hands, and nodded slowly. If that's what you think is best. Inside, though, it felt like a door slammed shut. Later that night, when the house grew quiet, I walked down the hallway, running my fingers along the grooves in the doorframe where Ethan's height had been marked each year. I could still see the smudges of pencil from when he was 5, 10, 15. I remembered the day I lifted him up so he could hammer his first nail into the backyard shed. He'd looked at me with such pride, as if he'd joined me in the brotherhood of men who built things with their hands. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the old photograph of my late wife Margaret in her Sunday dress standing by the very porch Ethan now wanted to give away. She had trusted me to protect this home, to keep it in the family. I whispered to her frame, I haven't failed you yet. The next morning, Monica wasted no time. By noon, she was on the phone with friends telling them about her house. I heard her voice carry through the open window as she stood on the porch laughing. Yes, can you believe it? Ethan finally put the deed in my name. About time, right? Each word was a nail driven into my chest. I went out back away from her laughter and sat on the old bench beneath the maple tree. The wood was weathered, but it still held strong like me. Frank Miller, my neighbor from across the street, and an old buddy from church waved as he watered his garden. He ambled over, resting his elbows on the fence. Harold, he said, his voice low, I hear congratulations are in order. Monica's telling everyone she owns the place now. I managed to smile, though my throat tightened. That's what they tell me. Frank shook his head. You built this house. Folks around here know it. Don't let them forget. His words stuck with me long after he walked back across the street. That evening, Monica called Ethan into the living room. I sat in my recliner pretending to read the newspaper. "Ethan," she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction, "we should invite the Johnsons over this weekend. Show them the place, and maybe host a little dinner. It'll be good to let everyone see what's ours now." Ours. I lowered the paper slowly. The room seemed smaller, the walls closing in. Monica caught my eye and smiled as if daring me to object. I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I folded the newspaper, set it aside, and stood. My knees creaked as I made my way to the back porch. The evening air was cool and the street lamps had just flickered on. I looked out across the yard, the roses Margaret once planted, now overrun with weeds, and I thought about how easily weeds can take over when no one tends the soil. Inside, their laughter floated through the window. I let it roll past me, knowing deep in my bones that laughter like that doesn't last. A few days passed and the news traveled faster than I could have imagined. At the corner diner where I usually stopped for coffee with the other old-timers, I felt the shift in the air. People weren't cruel. No one said it outright, but I caught the glances. A woman at the counter whispered to her friend, "That's the man whose son signed his house over to the daughter-in-law." They tried to lower their voices, but I heard. At 70, my ears might miss the television some nights, but I never miss whispers. I sipped my black coffee, nodded politely to the waitress, and kept my eyes on the chipped mug. Pride is a stubborn thing. It makes you sit straighter even when you feel the weight pressing down. That Sunday, I walked into church alone. Ethan and Monica decided to visit friends, or at least that's what Ethan told me. I noticed how folks shook my hand a little differently, some with pity, others with that polite distance people use when they're not sure whether to treat you as respectable or foolish. The sermon was on honoring your parents, but I couldn't help thinking how those words seem to bounce right past my son these days. After service, Frank Miller caught up with me on the church steps. "Harold," he said, "don't let them walk all over you. You've given more to that boy than most fathers ever do." I smiled faintly. Maybe I gave him too much. Frank sighed, his face lined with years of hard work and disappointments of his own. Sometimes generosity turns into weakness in their eyes, but you and I know better. We walked together to the parking lot, the autumn leaves crunching under our shoes. I thought about Margaret again, how she would have handled this. She would have clasped my hand and reminded me that storms pass. But storms also strip roofs and break fences, and sometimes what's left is never quite the same. That evening, back at the house, Monica hosted a little gathering. She called it casual, but she set out her best wine glasses and made sure the neighbors knew to stop by. I sat quietly in the corner of the living room while she paraded through the house, gesturing to the crown molding, the hardwood floors, the fireplace I had laid brick by brick. "This is all ours now," she said proudly to one of her friends, not even bothering to glance my way. Ethan wanted to make sure I felt secure. A woman needs to know she's got a place that's truly hers. Her friend nodded approvingly, and I caught the faint smirk that tugged at Monica's lips. I excused myself and stepped onto the porch. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of burning leaves from somewhere down the block. I lowered myself onto the old porch swing, its chains groaning the way they always had. I ran my hand along the armrest where the paint had worn smooth over decades. Margaret used to sit here with me after long days sipping sweet tea and talking about nothing and everything. I closed my eyes and let the memory steady me. Inside, the voices grew louder. Glasses clinked, and laughter spilled through the open window. Each laugh felt like another reminder that the world I'd built was being rewritten piece by piece in Monica's favor. But I didn't speak, not yet. Instead, I watched the porch light flicker its bulb, struggling to hold steady. Something about that light struck me a reminder that even when it seems weak, a steady hand can replace it, tighten the fixture, make it shine again. I knew then that silence wasn't surrender. It was patience. And patience in my 70 years had always been the strongest tool in my belt. Monica didn't waste any time. Within days, the whole neighborhood seemed to know the story. Harold Whitaker, the old carpenter who spent his life in that house, had been pushed aside by his own son, and now his daughter-in-law strutted around calling the place hers. I didn't need to hear the words directly. I could feel them in the way people looked at me, a shift from respect to something else, pity, or worse, quiet amusement. One Saturday afternoon, Monica decided to host a backyard barbecue. It wasn't unusual in our neighborhood. Summer always brought out the grills and the smell of burgers and hot dogs. But this wasn't about food or fellowship. This was Monica's stage. She wore a bright red dress loud enough to turn heads and greeted guests like she was royalty. "Welcome to my home," she said, waving her hand toward the deck I had built with my own back when Ethan was barely tall enough to hold a hammer. "We're so glad to have everyone here. Isn't the yard just perfect?" People nodded, smiled politely, and I stood off to the side leaning on the porch rail. My chest tightened as I heard her say it again and again, my home. Not once did she mention the man who poured decades of sweat into every beam and board. Not once did she acknowledge Margaret's touch on the rose bushes or the hours I spent patching the roof. Frank Miller gave me a sympathetic glance across the yard. He was spooning potato salad onto his plate, but his eyes said everything he knew this wasn't right. Harold, one of the younger neighbors, said as he passed me a plate of ribs, "You're lucky, you know. Not every man has family to take care of the place when he's older." I forced a smile though the words cut. Lucky. That was what they called it, when your own son stripped you of your name on the deed. As the evening went on, the music played louder, the drinks flowed, and Monica's voice carried over it all. She told stories of how she planned to repaint the living room, how she might remodel the kitchen, how this house was the perfect investment for our future, our future. I stood in the shadows of the porch, a ghost in my own home. When the last of the guests left and the backyard lights dimmed, I walked back through the house. The scent of smoke and grilled meat lingered in the air, but beneath it was the quiet ache of something deeper. The knowledge that my place in my son's story had been rewritten without my consent. The next morning I went to church. I always sat near the back, not because I was late, but because it gave me a view of the whole congregation. Normally it felt comforting to see familiar faces, people I'd shared decades with in this community. But that Sunday the air felt different. As I shook hands on the steps, I caught whispers. A woman leaned to her husband, murmuring, "That's him, the one who lost his house." Another said softly, "Poor Harold. Must be hard getting pushed out like that." Their voices weren't cruel, but they were sharp enough to slice pride. I nodded, smiled, and kept walking. My feet felt heavy on the church floorboards. The pastor spoke about forgiveness and patience, his voice rising with conviction. "Honor thy father and thy mother," he read from the pulpit. The words seemed to hang in the air longer than usual, almost as if they had been aimed at Ethan himself. But Ethan wasn't there. He and Monica had decided once again to spend their Sunday elsewhere. When the service had ended, I shook hands for small talk and stepped out into the bright sun. Frank Miller joined me on the steps. "Harold," he said quietly, "don't let them do this to you. You've earned more respect than this whole town combined." I let out a slow breath. Maybe respect doesn't buy much these days, Frank. Maybe I gave too much, and now they think it means I have nothing left. Frank put a hand on my shoulder. Generosity isn't weakness. They'll learn that, one way or another. We walked down together, leaves crunching beneath our shoes, and I thought again of Margaret. She would have squeezed my hand, reminded me that storms never last. But I also knew storms could wash away everything you'd built, and when the sun came out again, the landscape was never the same. That evening, Ethan and Monica returned home. She looked flushed from laughter, dressed too fine for a simple Sunday out. I sat at the kitchen table, the newspaper spread before me, but unread. Monica glanced at me, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "Oh, Harold," she said, pouring herself a glass of iced tea. "You should have seen the looks on people's faces yesterday. They were so impressed. Everyone agrees this house suits me perfectly." I folded the newspaper slowly. "Funny," I said, my voice steady. "I thought it suited your mother just fine when she was alive." Her smile faltered for a heartbeat, but she quickly regained it. "Well, times change. People change. You can't expect everything to stay the same forever." I held her gaze for a long moment, then turned back to my paper. My hands trembled slightly as I gripped the edges, but I didn't let her see. I wasn't ready to speak all that was in my chest, not yet. Inside me, something pressed hard against the silence, wanting to break free. But I swallowed it down, knowing patience was its own kind of weapon. A few evenings later, I sat on the front porch while the streetlights blinked on one by one. The summer air was warm, carrying the faint hum of lawnmowers and children's laughter down the block. I used to feel a sense of pride on nights like that, watching the neighborhood thrive while I rested my bones after a day's work. But that night, it felt different. I could almost sense the whispers traveling with the breeze. Two women walked their dogs past my yard, and I caught part of their conversation. "It's a shame," one of them said softly. "Imagine being pushed aside like that in your own house." The other shook her head. "That poor old man. He probably doesn't even know what's happening." I did know. Every word sank deep, and though they didn't mean harm, pity stings worse than scorn. The next Saturday, Ethan suggested we join Monica's friend for a cookout at the Johnsons' place. I didn't want to go, but he insisted. "It'll be good for appearances," he said, as though my life was just another backdrop for Monica's show. When we arrived, Monica strutted in first, laughing, tossing her hair, greeting everyone as though she were queen of the block. I followed behind slower, my steps heavy. Inside their backyard, people were gathered with drinks, paper plates piled with food, the air buzzing with chatter. At some point, I overheard Monica telling a group of women, "Yes, Ethan made the decision. He put the house in my name. I told him it was time. A woman has to feel secure. And Harold, well, he's still there, of course, but we manage everything now." Laughter followed. It wasn't cruel, but it was sharp enough. I felt my ears burn. My instinct was to step forward to remind them all that no one managed this house but me, not for 70 years. My mouth opened, words ready. But I stopped. I caught Ethan's eyes across the yard. He looked pale, uneasy, but he didn't say a word either. He sipped his drink, looked at his shoes. That silence told me more than anything else. He knew it was wrong, but he lacked the courage to stand up to her. I turned away, found an empty chair near the fence, and sat down. My heart pounded with the urge to speak, to reclaim some dignity, but I clenched my jaw, forced myself to stay quiet. Sometimes silence is the only shield you have left. On the ride home, the car was filled with Monica's chatter about who admired the garden, who envied the kitchen remodel she planned. Ethan drove, eyes fixed on the road, barely speaking. I sat in the back seat like an unwelcome passenger in a life that once was mine. That night, lying awake in my bed, I stared at the ceiling fan spinning lazily. The shadows stretched across the room, familiar and yet foreign. My chest ached, not from age, but from the weight of humiliation. I thought about all the years I'd taught Ethan to stand tall, to tell the truth, to honor his word. And now here I was, the lesson erased, my dignity pawned off in exchange for Monica's pride. Still, I said nothing. Not yet. Because deep down I knew there would come a time when silence would no longer be patience, it would be power. It started with the phone calls. At first, they came in the evenings just after supper when the house grew quiet. The phone would ring sharp and insistent, cutting through the stillness. Ethan always moved fast to answer, his voice, lowered, words clipped. He'd step out onto the porch, closing the screen door behind him, leaving me to sit at the kitchen table with my coffee cooling in my hands. I didn't ask, not right away, but a father knows when something is wrong with his son. The way Ethan rubbed his forehead, the way his shoulders tensed like he was carrying bricks instead of skin and bones, it was clear enough. One afternoon, as I walked down the hall, I caught a glimpse of him shoving a thick envelope into the drawer of his desk. He must have thought no one saw, but I did. Later, when he was out, I found that drawer cracked open just enough to reveal a red stamp across the top of a letter, past due. I sat back staring at it. The boy I raised had once been proud, careful. I'd taught him how to balance a checkbook before he was old enough to shave. And now here he was, hiding overdue notices like a child sneaking candy before dinner. Monica, on the other hand, floated around the house without a care in the world. She spent afternoons browsing catalogs, talking about new furniture, a remodeled kitchen vacation she wanted to take. Credit cards seemed to slide through her fingers like water. And Ethan, instead of stopping her, seemed desperate to keep up. One evening, as Monica talked about a trip to California wine country, Ethan's jaw tightened. He excused himself, stepping out back with his phone pressed to his ear. Through the window, I caught the faint words, "I just need more time. Please, I'll get the money." When he came back inside, his face was pale. Monica didn't notice, or maybe she didn't care. She kept talking about wineries, sunsets, tastings. I sat in my recliner, listening, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down again. That night, lying in bed, I thought back to the years Ethan had been out of work. He'd been laid off from the factory when the economy dipped. For months, he'd drifted sleeping late, snapping at me when I suggested odd jobs. Monica had been sharp with him then, too, her voice slicing through the house, reminding him of bills of her friends' husbands, with good jobs and bigger homes. I had watched the shame settle into my son's bones like winter frost. I remember the day he finally found work again, how he puffed out his chest, brought Monica flowers, and told her he'd prove he could provide. That look in his eyes never left me. It was pride, yes, but also desperation, the hunger to be enough for her. Now, years later, I could still see that hunger in the way he bent under her demands. It made me ache to realize my boy wasn't just weak. He was trapped in a cage of his own promises. One Sunday after service, Frank Miller and I sat on the church steps, sipping from the styrofoam cups of lukewarm coffee they always served in the fellowship hall. He looked at me with the steady eyes of a man who'd seen his share of storms. "Harold," he said, "I hear talk. Folks say Ethan's in deep with the bank. Is that true?" I didn't answer right away. I stared at the churchyard at the kids, running between parked cars, their laughter echoing. "I don't know the full of it," I finally said. "But I know worry when I see it on my boy's face." Frank shook his head slowly. "A man can only hide so much before it all spills out. You deserved better than this, Harold." His words settled heavy in my chest. Deserved better. Maybe so. But what a man deserves and what he gets are rarely the same thing. That night back home, I found another envelope stuffed into the trash buried beneath Monica's glossy catalogs. I pulled it out, smoothed the crumpled paper, and saw the figures glaring back at me. Numbers that spoke louder than any argument. Debt. More debt than Ethan could ever handle. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the trash. My hands trembled, not just from age, but from the cold realization that this wasn't a storm Ethan could weather. And if Monica had anything to do with it, and I suspected she did, it was a storm she'd created, while he scrambled to hold the walls up. I sat alone in the kitchen, the clock ticking on the wall each second like a hammer strike. My son was drowning, and instead of reaching for me, he was letting Monica hand him more weights. A few evenings later, I heard Ethan's voice carrying from the garage. I had stepped out to take the trash, but the tone in his words made me pause. His back was turned, phone pressed tight to his ear, and his free hand was braced on the workbench as if it were the only thing holding him up. "I told you I'll make the payment," he said, his voice raw. "Just give me until the end of the month. Please." "I can't let them know. Not yet." The silence on the other end stretched too long. When he hung up, he leaned against the wall, shoulders sagging as if the air itself weighed him down. I wanted to step forward to put a hand on his arm, to tell him that secrets have a way of poisoning a man from the inside out. But I didn't. He wasn't ready to hear it. Later that night, I found him at the kitchen table with a calculator, stacks of papers spread around him like storm debris. Monica breezed past, dropping a shopping bag onto the counter, humming as if nothing in the world were wrong. Ethan shoved the papers together quickly, stuffing them into a folder as if he could hide his shame beneath cardboard. I caught his eye, and for just a second, the boy I remembered, the one who used to come to me for advice about fixing a leaky faucet or building a treehouse, was there, vulnerable, frightened. But then he looked away, jaw-tight mask back on. The next day, Monica cornered me in the living room. She was holding a glossy magazine, pointing out a set of kitchen cabinets. "Don't you think these would brighten up the place? I told Ethan we should redo the kitchen." He agreed. "We're due for a change." I looked at her and wondered how she couldn't see the cracks forming right under her feet. Or maybe she saw them and didn't care so long as she could show off a shiny surface to her friends. "You know," I said quietly, "sometimes change isn't what a house needs. Sometimes it just needs care." She laughed, a brittle sound. "That's the difference between us, Harold. You patch, I improve." That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in the darkened living room listening to the refrigerator hum, the old floorboards creak with the settling of the house. I thought about Ethan, about the years he spent out of work, about the way Monica's words back then had carved at him until he bent himself into a shape that suited her. I remembered him coming home once, after another failed interview, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled. "She thinks I'm worthless, Dad," he'd said, then voice breaking. I had told him he wasn't that hard times come and go, that he just needed to keep trying. But looking back now, I wondered if those scars had never fully healed. Now he was bleeding again, only this time it wasn't pride, it was money, and the wounds were deeper. The following Sunday after service, Frank Miller lingered with me in the church parking lot. He lit a cigarette, though his wife hated it, and squinted against the sun. "I don't like what I'm hearing, Harold. Banks don't call like that unless something's real wrong. If Ethan's playing with fire, you'll get burned too." I didn't answer right away. The bell from the church tower echoed across the town, steady and solemn. Finally, I said, "Maybe. But sometimes a man has to learn fire burns by feeling the flame himself." Frank shook his head. "That may be true, but it doesn't mean you have to stand in the ashes." His words followed me home. That evening I found another letter in the mail pile, one Ethan had shoved to the bottom. I slipped it out quietly, unfolded it with shaking hands. The numbers screamed louder than any sermon: payments missed, debt. Mounting interest climbing like a vine choking the walls. I folded it back up, slid it beneath the stack again. I sat at the kitchen table long after the house grew quiet, the tick of the clock filling the silence. My son was drowning, and I was forced to watch him go under while Monica danced on the surface, pretending the water was calm. I told myself to be patient. But patience, I knew, was only useful if you had a plan. And I could feel the beginnings of one stirring inside me, faint as a spark. It was Monica's idea to attend the HOA meeting. She insisted on it, said it was our duty as homeowners. But I knew better. She wanted an audience. We sat in the small community center that served as the neighborhood's gathering place. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the smell of burnt coffee drifted from a table in the corner. Folks shuffled in with folders and papers, ready to argue about lawn regulations and trash pickup times. It was nothing new to me. I'd been sitting in these meetings for decades. But this time I wasn't just another neighbor. I was part of Monica's performance. She sat tall, chin lifted, dressed as if she were attending a business luncheon instead of a local HOA meeting. Ethan sat beside her, shoulders hunched, flipping through the agenda, like it could shield him from what was coming. When her turn came to speak, Monica stood, her voice bright and confident. "As the new owner of our home on Maple Street, I want to make sure the neighborhood knows we'll be contributing to the community. We've already talked about updates to the property, and I intend to maintain high standards." The word "new owner" echoed in my ears. A few heads turned toward me, a surprise flickering across their faces. Some looked down quickly as if embarrassed for me. Monica continued unbothered. "We all know how important it is to keep our neighborhood thriving," she said, smiling sweetly. "And I feel it's time to bring fresh energy into the house on the corner. I appreciate that Harold has been there for years, but now Ethan and I are taking things forward." She said it like I was a relic, something that had lingered too long in the background, tolerated but no longer needed. My name wasn't even spoken as the homeowner, only a shadow in her sentence. I sat stiff in my chair, hands folded tight, my knuckles white. A dozen responses flared in my chest. I wanted to stand to remind them all who laid every board of that house, who mowed that lawn through storms and scorching summers. But I didn't. I let the silence stretch my jaw, locked, the weight of humiliation pressing down again. After the meeting, a few neighbors approached me quietly. Mrs. Connors, a widow who lived down the street, touched my arm gently. "Don't you mind her," she whispered. "We know what you've done for that house." Folks remember. Her kindness was a balm, but it couldn't erase the sting of what I'd heard. Others weren't so kind. As I walked out to the parking lot, I overheard two men talking near the doorway. "Maybe Harold really is slipping," one of them muttered. "He let them take over the house. Maybe he's not all there anymore." The words landed like stones. Not just betrayal now, but doubt about my very mind. That night I sat on the porch swing long after the street had gone quiet. The creak of the chains was the only sound. I thought about Margaret again, how she used to lean against me during these summer nights, whispering about the future, about how Ethan would grow into a strong man. She'd believed in him, believed in me. And here I was, watching the cracks widen, hearing whispers that I was no longer capable, no longer fit to hold on to the life we built. The next week, word reached me through Frank. He stopped by after church, his cap in his hands. "Harold," he said carefully, "there's talk. Someone in the HOA mentioned maybe Ethan should file for conservatorship, said it might be time to take legal responsibility, seeing as you're older." Older. The word tasted bitter. I set down my coffee mug, staring at the worn wood of the table. Conservatorship, I repeated, letting it sink in. That wasn't just talk of humiliation anymore. That was talk of stripping me of every decision, every ounce of independence. Frank leaned closer. Don't let them do this, Harold. Once papers are signed, it's near impossible to get your rights back. I nodded slowly, the weight of it pressing hard against my chest. They thought they could silence me, box me into a corner, erase me one step at a time. But patience had always been my weapon, and I knew now it was time to sharpen it. The whispers didn't stop after that meeting. If anything, they grew louder, curling their way through the neighborhood like smoke. At the grocery store, I caught the sideways glances. At church, I noticed the lowered voices when I walked past. Once outside the diner, a man I'd known for 30 years clapped me on the back and said, "Don't worry, Harold. We all slow down eventually." His tone was kindly, but I heard the undertone. They thought I was fading. One evening, I came into the kitchen just as Ethan was folding a paper, quickly shoving it into his pocket. Monica stood at the counter, her lips curved in that smug smile she wore like perfume. "What's that?" I asked, though my voice was calm. Ethan avoided my eyes. "Nothing, just HOA notes." I looked at him, then at Monica. She met my gaze squarely, her eyes glittering. "We were discussing options," she said. "Some people think it might be best if Ethan took a little more responsibility, legal responsibility." The word hung in the air like a blade. She wanted me to react, wanted me to flare up so she could point and say, "See, he's unstable." Instead, I leaned against the doorframe, keeping my voice even. "I've managed on my own for 70 years, I said. "I don't need a keeper now." Ethan shifted, his face pale. "Dad, it's not like that. People just worry about you." I let the silence stretch, watching him squirm. Then I nodded slowly. "If they're worried, maybe it's because someone's been feeding them reasons to be." Monica's smile faltered for half a second before snapping back into place. "We just want what's best." I walked past them out onto the porch and let the screen door slam shut behind me. The night air was cool and the stars flickered faint above the street lamps. My hands trembled slightly, but not from weakness, from anger. From the knowledge that they weren't just taking my house, they were trying to take me. That Sunday, the pastor preached on endurance, on keeping faith when trials pressed hardest. I sat in my usual spot near the back, but instead of shame, I felt something else rising in me. Resolve. When the service ended, neighbors offered polite smiles, some with pity, some with awkward kindness. Mrs. Connors patted my hand again, whispering, "Don't you let them do this, Harold. You're stronger than they think." I thanked her, and as I stepped into the sunlight, Frank joined me, his face set. "They're playing a dangerous game, Harold," he said. "But remember, once they show their hand, that's when you can play yours." I looked out across the churchyard, children chasing each other between the cars, the sound of laughter cutting through the summer air. My chest tightened, but this time it wasn't from humiliation. It was from a fire sparking inside me, one I hadn't felt in years. They thought they could strip me of my dignity. They thought they could whisper me into silence, into a corner. But I wasn't finished, not yet. I knew then that betrayal has its own sound, not just in the loud boasts of Monica, but in the quiet murmurs of neighbors who'd once respected me. And I knew, too, that the day was coming when silence would no longer be my shield. It would be my weapon. 2 weeks passed, though it felt longer. The whispers hadn't died down. If anything, the neighborhood seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the next piece of gossip to float down Maple Street. And then one muggy afternoon it arrived. I was sitting on the porch, the paper folded on my lap, when a car I didn't recognize pulled into the driveway. The logo on the door read, First Cascade Bank. 2 men in pressed shirts stepped out their briefcases, swinging their eyes, scanning the house like it was already theirs. Ethan came rushing from inside Monica, right behind him. She wore that fixed smile, the one she used at parties when she wanted to look in control. But her hands gave her away. They fidgeted with the hem of her blouse, twisting and tugging. "Mr. Whitaker," one of the bankers asked, though his gaze flicked past me to Ethan. Ethan cleared his throat. "Yes, I'm Ethan Whitaker." The man nodded, pulling out a folder. "We're here regarding the outstanding balance on the mortgage. Payments have been overdue for some time. Unless immediate arrangements are made, the bank will have no choice but to proceed with foreclosure. The word hit me harder than I expected, even though I'd already suspected something was wrong. Foreclosure. On the house, I built the house where Margaret raised her roses, where Ethan took his first steps. Monica's smile cracked. "There must be some mistake," she said quickly. "This house is ours. We've been taking care of everything." The banker's eyes were cool, professional. "Ma'am, the records are clear. Mr. Whitaker took out a substantial loan against this property years ago. The account is in serious default." I looked at Ethan then. His face was pale, his lips pressed tight. For a moment the boy in him came through, the boy caught in a lie, cornered with nowhere to run. Monica rounded on him. "You told me you had it handled." She hissed, her voice sharp enough for the neighbors gathering at the edge of the lawn to hear. He didn't answer. He just stood there, shoulders slumped, as if the weight of every secret letter and late-night phone call had finally crashed down. One by one, neighbors began to drift closer, pretending to water flowers or check their mail, but their eyes stayed locked on us. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "Foreclosure debt, Whitakers." I stayed seated on the porch, hands folded, saying nothing. But inside my chest burned. Not from shame, no, I had nothing to be ashamed of. The shame belonged to the two standing in the driveway, exposed for all to see. The banker closed his folder with a snap. "We'll need to finalize the paperwork soon. Unless you can produce the funds, this property will revert to bank ownership." Monica's face drained of color. Ethan looked like a man already drowning. And me, I simply turned my head and caught Samuel Green's eye. My attorney had been waiting quietly at the end of the block, just as we'd planned. I didn't say a word, but the look I gave him was enough. A signal. Because while they thought I was cornered, the truth was the game had only just begun. The silence that followed was heavier than the summer heat. Monica glanced around, realizing every set of eyes on Maple Street was fixed on her. The queen of neighborhood parties, the woman who strutted at HOA meetings, now stood cornered in her own driveway. Her voice cracked as she turned on Ethan. "How could you let it come to this? You said the house was secure, that everything was covered." Ethan finally spoke, his words low and broken. "I did what I had to do, Monica. You kept spending the bills piled up, and I couldn't keep up." Neighbors gasped softly. A woman on the sidewalk clutched her husband's arm. Mr. Connors shook his head, muttering something about shame. Monica's face flushed red, but not from embarrassment, anger. She jabbed her finger at Ethan's chest. "Don't you dare put this on me. You're the one who signed those papers. You're the one who mortgaged this place." He staggered back a step, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. For years he had tried to stand tall for her, tried to prove himself. Now he was nothing more than a man stripped bare in front of his father, his wife, and his community. I sat still, watching the storm unravel. Every word, every accusation was another crack in the image they had built. The same neighbors who once whispered that I was fading now saw the truth with their own eyes. The banker cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the scene, but bound to his duty. "I suggest you both seek immediate counsel. Without payment, foreclosure will proceed within the month." He handed Ethan a stack of documents. Ethan's hands trembled as he took them, the pages fluttering in the breeze like white flags of surrender. Monica covered her face with one hand, her voice sharp but thin. "This can't be happening. Not to me, not to us." The crowd lingered, unwilling to leave, as if this spectacle had turned into a public trial. I could feel their eyes shift toward me, searching for my reaction. Would I shout? Would I curse them? No. I simply straightened in my chair, the porch swing creaking softly under my weight, and let the silence speak for me. Then slowly I turned my head toward Samuel Green, who stood near the curb with his leather briefcase in hand. Our eyes met, and I gave the smallest of nods. It wasn't time yet, not quite, but the message was clear. Patience had carried me this far, and now with the bank's threat hanging over Ethan and Monica like a storm cloud, I knew the tide was about to turn. They thought I was just an old man sitting quietly while my world crumbled. But in truth, I was waiting for the right moment to show them I hadn't lost a step. Not yet. And when that moment came, they'd realize the house on Maple Street was never really theirs to claim. The day they came to the house felt heavier than any storm I'd weathered. The bankers from First Cascade returned their folders thicker, their expressions colder. This time they stepped straight into the living room as if the place already belonged to them. Ethan hovered near the fireplace, his shoulders hunched, his fingers pulling at the hem of his shirt. Monica sat on the edge of the couch, her lipstick too bright for the occasion, her hands trembling in her lap. She tried to hide it, but the truth was written all over her face. Fear had finally cracked her confidence. I sat in my armchair, the same one I had lowered myself into every evening for decades. The bankers spread their papers across the coffee table, explaining in clipped tones that foreclosure proceedings would begin immediately. Their voices droned like a clock ticking down to midnight. Monica let out a sob, pressing her palms to her cheeks. "Please, there has to be another way. We didn't mean for it to get this far." Ethan finally spoke, his voice breaking. "Give us more time. Just a little more. I can fix this." The lead banker shook his head. "I'm afraid it's out of our hands. Unless payment is made, the bank assumes control of the property." The word settled like a funeral bell in the room. Neighbors had begun to gather outside again, faces pressed to the windows, bodies shifting on the porch. Maple Street had turned into a stage, and we were the unwilling actors in the play of shame. I leaned forward slowly, my hands steady, despite the storm swirling around me. "Before you finalize anything," I said, my voice calm, "even I believe you'll want to see this." All eyes turned toward me as Samuel Green, who had been standing quietly near the doorway, opened his leather briefcase. He withdrew a document, crisp and deliberate, and placed it on top of the banker's stack. "What's this?" the banker asked, suspicion creeping into his tone. Samuel adjusted his glasses. A contractual addendum. Filed and notarized at the time the house was transferred to Mr. Ethan Whitaker. It stipulates that if the property is ever mortgage foreclosed or leaves the bloodline of Harold Whitaker, ownership reverts immediately to Mr. Whitaker himself. The room went utterly silent. Monica's sobs stopped mid-breath. Ethan's face drained of the little color it had left. The banker frowned, flipping through the pages, his pen tapping against the folder. "I'll need to verify this. It's highly unusual." "Unusual doesn't mean invalid," Samuel replied smoothly. "The law recognizes contingencies in property transfers, and this one was crafted with precision." Ethan stumbled forward, his voice raw. "Dad, please, don't do this. We can work something out. Just let us fix it." I looked at him, not the grown man who stood before me, but the boy I once held steady on a bicycle, the boy I guided through his first day of school. Somewhere along the way, that boy had been lost, swallowed up by pride and poor choices. "You had your chance," I said quietly. "Now it's my turn." Monica burst into tears, clutching Ethan's arm. "Make him stop, Ethan. Please make him stop." But Ethan had no words left, only silence. The banker cleared his throat, placing the addendum back on the table. "This will require review by our legal department. Until then, foreclosure is suspended." Gasps rippled from the porch outside. Neighbors leaned closer to the glass, hungry for every detail. Suspended. The word hung in the air, a lifeline, a pause. Not victory yet, but the taste of it lingered. And as Samuel gathered the papers, I settled back into my chair, my heart steady. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, the ground beneath my feet felt solid again. The men from the bank packed their folders with stiff movements, their professional calm slightly rattled. They weren't used to being challenged, not like this. One of them muttered about unusual provisions, while the other kept glancing at Samuel as though sizing him up. When they left, the neighbors outside parted like a sea whispering in currents as the bankers pushed through. I heard the words float across the yard: addendum, loophole. Harold, maybe he's not so helpless after all. Monica collapsed onto the couch, her mascara streaking down her cheeks. She looked less like the polished hostess she tried so hard to be, and more like a desperate woman with nowhere to run. "You can't do this," she cried, her voice sharp with both fear and rage. "You can't just take it back. That house, it's ours now." I rose slowly from my chair, each step deliberate. "No," I said, my voice low, but cutting. "It was never yours. You treated it like a trophy, something to wave around at barbecues and meetings. But a house isn't built on paper, Monica. It's built on sacrifice. And you never lifted a hammer for this one." Her mouth opened, but no words came. She turned to Ethan, clawing at his sleeve. "Say something. Do something." Ethan stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the floorboards as if they might open and swallow him whole. Finally, he whispered, "I didn't know he kept it." I didn't know. Samuel cleared his throat, slipping the addendum back into his case. "The bank will review, but Harold has protected himself. Legally, this document carries weight." He looked at me, his voice firm. "You were wise to think ahead." I gave a slow nod. For months, I had carried the humiliation in silence, letting them believe they had beaten me. All the while, the paper sat tucked away waiting for its day. And now, at last, it had come. Ethan finally lifted his head, his eyes wet. "Dad, please, don't let it end like this. I just wanted to prove I could take care of my family. I didn't mean to hurt you." His words clawed at me, but I didn't soften. "You proved something, Ethan. You proved what happens when pride blinds a man to the hand that raised him." The room fell still again. Outside, the neighbors lingered, too curious to leave. Some faces looked pitying, others quietly satisfied, as though they had just witnessed a moral verdict handed down without a gavel. The banker's car pulled away and the murmurs of the crowd slowly faded. Inside, Monica wept quietly into her hands, and Ethan sat on the edge of the couch like a boy who had lost his way back home. I stood at the window, the fading light of evening stretching across the lawn. The battle wasn't won yet. The bank still had to decide, the papers still had to be verified. But the balance had shifted. For the first time since Ethan handed that house over to Monica, I felt something return to me, not just the possibility of ownership, but the dignity that had been stripped away piece by piece. And as I watched the neighbors drift off into the dusk, I knew one thing for certain. Silence had carried me far, but now silence had spoken, and it would speak again. The week after the bankers left Maple Street buzzed like a hive struck with a stick. It wasn't just gossip now. It was debate, speculation, and judgment delivered in whispers over fences and loud opinions at the diner counter. I couldn't step outside without catching fragments. He had it planned all along. Never thought Harold had that in him. Maybe we've been looking at the wrong Whitaker this whole time. It spread faster than truth usually does because it carried all the drama. People craved betrayal, debt secrets, and now a father's unexpected stand. Monica bore the brunt first. Her phone calls went unanswered. Women who once flocked to her garden parties now crossed the street to avoid her. I saw her one afternoon standing on the porch, phone in hand, pacing like a caged bird. She looked smaller without her audience, as though her confidence needed an audience to survive. Ethan was quieter than I'd ever seen him. He still left for work, but his walk had changed, no longer brisk, just a shuffle head down. At church, he lingered near the back instead of front pews. People noticed. They always notice. The pastor's sermon that Sunday was gentle but firm. "Honor thy father and thy mother." He read from the pulpit, his voice echoing against the wooden beams. He didn't look at Ethan directly, but he didn't have to. The words hung there heavy and unavoidable. I felt them too, though differently, like a reminder that even justice carried weight, and that weight was mine to bear with dignity. After service, small clusters of people surrounded Monica and Ethan. The conversations were short-clipped, polite in a way that stung worse than outright cruelty. By contrast, people who had avoided me weeks earlier now paused to shake my hand. Mrs. Connors brought me a slice of pie after the potluck, her eyes kind. "You keep holding your head high, Harold. Folks are seeing the truth now." I thanked her, though my voice caught. Dignity felt like a fragile thing, easy to lose, hard to rebuild. That afternoon, I sat on my porch again, watching the neighborhood kids pedal their bikes down the street. For the first time in months, a boy waved as he passed. It was a small thing, but it landed like a stone in a still pond, rippling out inside me. Late that evening, as the crickets sang in the yard, a figure lingered at the edge of my driveway. It was Mark Wilson, the young man from 3 houses down. He'd laughed the loudest at Monica's declaration weeks before. He shifted his weight hands in his pockets. "Mr. Whitaker?" I nodded, waiting. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, his voice rough. "I was wrong to believe what I heard, wrong to laugh. I see now you weren't the fool everyone made you out to be." I studied him for a long moment, the way the porch light carved his face into sharp angles. Then I nodded again, slower this time. "Takes something to admit that, son. Thank you." His shoulders eased. "I guess. I just wanted you to know." As he walked away, I leaned back in the swing, the chains groaning softly. The judgment of the community cut both ways. It could wound, but it could also mend. And maybe, just maybe, I was starting to feel the tide turn. The days that followed were filled with a strange quiet, the kind that only comes when people don't know which way to lean. Some neighbors still whispered about me behind their curtains, but others began nodding as I passed, little gestures that spoke louder than words. Monica, meanwhile, seemed to vanish into the walls of the house. I rarely saw her outside. When I did, her steps were hurried, her face hidden behind sunglasses. She had thrived on being the center of attention, and now that the spotlight burned too hot, she couldn't stand it. Ethan wasn't spared either. At the hardware store, I overheard a clerk ask him, "So how's your dad holding up?" Ethan mumbled something and left quickly, his shoulders stooped as though the weight of the question pressed him into the ground. At church the following Sunday, the pastor's words lingered even longer. He spoke of humility, of pride before the fall, and of the strength it takes to admit wrong. I sat through the sermon with my hands folded, my eyes steady on the pulpit. Ethan sat 3 rows behind me. I didn't turn around, but I felt his eyes on my back. After the service, I chose to linger in the fellowship hall. The potluck tables were heavy with casseroles, pies, and bowls of potato salad. Conversations hummed around me. For weeks I had avoided those tables, ashamed of being the subject of gossip. But that day I accepted a plate, sat down, and let the voices wash over me. Mrs. Connors leaned across the table, her tone warm. "Harold, it's good to see you here. It's about time." Others nodded in agreement. The message was clear. The community's perception was shifting. They weren't just watching anymore, they were choosing sides. That evening, back on my porch, I let the cool air settle into my bones. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet. A thought crept into my mind. Steady and certain dignity wasn't something handed out by neighbors or even taken away by children. It was something you carried quietly until the day came to show it. For the first time in a long while, I felt the stirrings of peace. But I also knew the story wasn't over. The bank still had its say, and Ethan still had choices to make. The judgment of the community was powerful, but the final reckoning would cut deeper than gossip ever could. And as the porch light flickered on, casting a halo over the old wood beneath my feet, I whispered to myself, "The tide's turning, Margaret. They're finally starting to see." The letter from the bank arrived in a thick envelope, its seal crisp, the kind of official weight you could feel before even opening it. I sat at the kitchen table, the afternoon sun slanting across the wood, and turned it over in my hands. My breath slowed, steadying as though my body already knew what the words inside would say. Samuel sat across from me, calm as ever, his briefcase propped against the chair. "Go ahead," he said, nodding. I slid a finger beneath the flap and pulled the papers free. The bank's letterhead gleamed at the top, followed by the words I had been waiting for. "The addendum has been reviewed and deemed valid. Effective. Immediately ownership of the property reverts to Harold Whitaker." For a moment the room was silent except for the hum of the old refrigerator. My hands trembled, not from age this time, but from the flood of relief washing through me. They recognized it. Samuel said, his voice warm with quiet triumph. "It's yours again. Legally, fully beyond dispute." I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The house, my house, was safe. Word traveled fast. By the time evening fell, neighbors had gathered outside, drawn as if by some invisible call. The story had been building for weeks, and now it had reached its crescendo. They stood in the yard on the sidewalk, some with arms folded, others whispering, all waiting to see how it would end. Ethan and Monica arrived not long after. Ethan's face was drawn, his tie loose, his eyes dark with sleepless nights. Monica looked worse, her makeup smeared as though she had cried before stepping out of the car. Together they walked up the path, each step heavier than the last. Inside the living room, the bankers returned with their official papers. Their demeanor had changed. The cool authority of weeks past had been replaced by a grudging respect. One of them cleared his throat and read aloud, his voice carrying through the open windows to the crowd outside. "After review of the legal addendum, it has been confirmed that ownership of this property reverts to Mr. Harold Whitaker." Gasps echoed outside. I rose from my chair slowly but firmly and faced the room. "This house," I said, my voice steady, each word deliberate, "returns to its rightful place." Samuel placed a supportive hand on my shoulder. The bankers nodded curtly, gathering their files. Their role was finished. Monica crumpled onto the couch, her face buried in her hands. Ethan stood rigid, staring at the floor as though, if he didn't look up, none of this would be real. Through the window, I heard clapping. It started with one person, Mark Wilson, the young man who had apologized to me. Then another joined, and another until the whole yard was alive with applause. It wasn't just for me, it was for the idea of justice, for the belief that wrongs could be righted, that dignity once stripped could be reclaimed. I looked at Ethan then. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Monica sobbed beside him, her shoulders shaking. And for the first time in a long while, I felt no shame, only clarity. The verdict had been delivered not by gavel or judge, but by the law, by the bank, by the watchful eyes of the community. And by me, by my choice to fight back. The applause outside grew louder, rolling like a tide down Maple Street. I never thought I'd hear it again. Neighbors clapping for me, not out of pity, but out of respect. It was the kind of sound that could mend a man's spirit stitch by stitch. I stepped closer to the window, the evening light spilling across the lawn. Faces I'd known for decades looked back at me with something new in their eyes. It wasn't just sympathy, it was recognition. They had seen me endure the whispers, the humiliation, the threats of foreclosure, and now they saw me, standing tall. Behind me, Monica's sobs broke through the moment. "This isn't fair," she cried, her voice raw. "We built our lives around this house. How can it just be taken away?" I turned, meeting her tear-streaked face. "You built your life around appearances, Monica. But appearances don't hold when the foundation is rotten." She shook her head, clutching her knees as though she could hold the world together by sheer will. Ethan finally lifted his gaze, his eyes red. "Dad," he started, but the words faltered. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment I thought I saw the boy he used to be, the boy who once ran to me after skinning his knee, trusting I could fix anything. But this wound he had made himself. "This house isn't about walls or windows," I told him. "It's about family. And when you traded that away, you lost more than a roof over your head." His jaw tightened. He nodded slightly as though the truth had finally landed where excuses couldn't reach. Outside, the clapping softened into murmurs. Some neighbors called out words I couldn't fully hear, but the tone was unmistakable support, approval, solidarity. Maple Street for once stood with me. The bankers slipped out quietly, their work done. Samuel closed his briefcase with a firm snap and gave me a nod. "It's settled. You've won, Harold. Won." The word tasted strange, not sweet, but steady, like bread after a long fast. I sank back into my armchair, the room heavy with silence except for Monica's muffled crying. Ethan stood beside her, one hand hovering near her shoulder but never touching, as though even he wasn't sure if comfort still had a place between them. Through the open window a breeze drifted in, carrying the faint sound of children laughing somewhere down the street. Life went on. The house was mine again, yes. But more than that, my dignity had been restored in the eyes of those who mattered and in my own. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the weight of it settle. Margaret would have wanted this, not the spectacle, but the justice. When I opened them again, I spoke into the quiet, not just to Ethan and Monica, but to the walls that had held my life, my love, my memories. This house returns to its rightful place, and this time no one dared to argue. The silence after the verdict was louder than the applause. Once the neighbors drifted home and the porch lights stopped flickering against their retreating backs, I was left with the hollow quiet of a house that had witnessed both triumph and ruin in a single evening. Ethan and Monica moved out the next day, or rather they were forced out. The bankers gave them a deadline, and with the addendum standing firm, they had no fight left to give. I watched from the window as boxes were carried to their car, Monica barking orders through tears, Ethan loading each carton with the weary slump of a man carrying more than cardboard. The neighborhood was merciless. People who once envied Monica's parties now watched with folded arms and whispered behind cupped hands. Children who used to ride their bikes up and down my driveway now pointed as the couple drove off. Betrayal had a price, and it was being tallied out loud for everyone to hear. For a few days I let the quiet wrap around me like an old quilt. I tended the garden, mowed the lawn, even repaired a loose shutter. Life was returning to something steadier, though never the same. Yet I knew it wasn't over. The wound betrayal leaves doesn't close with a single verdict. It was late afternoon when Ethan came back. I saw him walking up the drive, his steps heavy hands stuffed deep in his jacket pockets. He looked thinner. His hair mussed his tie gone. "Dad," he said when I opened the door, his voice rough. "Can I come in?" I hesitated, then stepped aside. He entered slowly like a man entering a church, unsure if he still belonged. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same place I'd read the letter that restored the house to me. For a long while, neither of us spoke. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "You don't understand what it's like," he said, leaning forward, his eyes sharp with a mix of anger and despair. "The bills, the pressure. Monica wanted more, always more, and I couldn't say no. I thought if I gave her what she wanted, she'd respect me. I thought if I proved myself, I'd matter." I studied him. The words sounded like excuses, but beneath them was the shadow of the boy who had once sought nothing but my approval. "You mattered long before the bills, Ethan," I said quietly. "But you chose her pride over your family's truth. You chose greed over trust." He flinched as though I'd struck him, but his jaw tightened. "It wasn't just greed, it was survival. You wouldn't understand." I leaned back, my hands folded on the table. "I understand survival better than you think. I worked 2 jobs to keep this house. I went without so you could have. Don't talk to me about survival. You had choices. You just didn't like the cost of the right ones." His eyes dropped at his shoulders, sagging. The fire drained out of him, leaving only fatigue. From the living room doorway, Monica appeared. I hadn't heard her come in, but there she stood, her eyes red-rimmed, her voice trembling. "Harold, please. Don't shut us out. We made mistakes, yes, but we're still family. We can fix this, if you'll just help us." Her tone was soft, almost desperate. A far cry from the triumphant woman who once bragged about driving me out of my own home. I shook my head slowly. "You both chose greed over family. Now you must live with that choice." The words hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Ethan stood, fists clenched, then unclenched, his face twisted with conflict, anger, shame, regret, all colliding. He didn't speak again. He simply turned and walked toward the door. Monica followed, casting one last glance back, her eyes pleading, but unanswered. When the door closed behind them, I let the silence return. Only this time it wasn't hollow, it was final. I stayed at the table long after they left, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock on the wall. The same walls that had held laughter arguments Christmas mornings and Margaret's quiet prayers now held a heavier kind of silence. It wasn't emptiness anymore. It was truth finally settled in. I thought about Ethan's face as he walked away, the storm of emotions fighting behind his eyes. There was anger, yes, but also something else, something softer. Regret, maybe even the first stirrings of shame. For all his faults, for all the ways he had failed me, I knew there was still a part of him that longed for something better than what he had become. But that was his journey to make, not mine to carry. The neighborhood didn't let the moment pass quietly. The next morning, Mrs. Connors left a pie on my porch with a note that read, "You did right, Harold. Some lessons are hard but necessary." The Wilson boy mowed my lawn without asking. Even Frank Miller, who had always been blunt to the point of cruelty, clasped my shoulder at church and muttered, "Proud of you, old friend." The shift was palpable. The whispers that once cut me down now built me up. My dignity had returned, not because the community gave it back, but because I had chosen to reclaim it. Still in the evenings when the shadows stretched long across the yard, I found myself staring down the road where Ethan and Monica had driven away. I wondered if Ethan replayed our conversation in his head as I did. I wondered if those words, "You both chose greed over family," would echo in him the way they echoed in me. Because even in betrayal, even in loss, a father's heart never stops hoping. Hoping the lesson lands. Hoping the love underneath the anger still counts for something. That night I stepped out onto the porch, the wood creaking beneath my feet. The air smelled of rain, the kind that cleanses more than it destroys. I sat in the old swing chains, groaning softly, and let the cool breeze wash over me. The price of betrayal was heavy, and Ethan and Monica were paying it now in full view of the world. But I had paid my share, 2 years of silence, years of swallowing hurt, until it nearly consumed me. Now the balance was set. The house was mine. My dignity was intact. The choice was theirs to live with. and as the porch light flickered on, casting a circle of gold around me, I whispered to the night, not bitterly, not triumphantly, but with the quiet finality of a man who had carried the weight and finally set it down. They'll have to find their own way now. The morning after Ethan and Monica left for good, I stepped out onto the front porch with a cup of coffee in hand. It was the same porch where I'd sat through summer storms, where Margaret and I had watched Ethan ride his bike for the first time, where neighbors once waved as they passed. For years I had avoided it, hiding behind drawn curtains, embarrassed by the whispers. But that morning I opened the screen door and let the air meet me head on. The neighborhood was quiet at first, dew still clinging to the grass. But soon people began to appear. Mrs. Connors, carrying her little dog, paused at the sidewalk and lifted a hand. "Morning, Harold." She called, her tone warm, respectful. I nodded back, my chest a tightening in a way that wasn't unpleasant. Across the street, young Mark Wilson raised his rake in greeting. "Looking good out here, Mr. Whitaker," I smiled, almost shy. For the first time in years, the greetings weren't tinged with pity or skepticism. They carried something different: acknowledgement, maybe even admiration. I sat down in the old rocking chair, the wood creaking beneath me. The coffee steamed in the cool air, and I thought about how strange it felt to be seen again, not as a burden, not as a man losing his grip, but as someone who had stood his ground. That Sunday I dressed in my best suit, Margaret's favorite, the gray one, with the neat lapels, and walked to church. Heads turned when I entered, but this time there were no whispers, no sidelong glances of doubt. Instead, people made space for me in the pew, smiling, nodding. The service went on as usual, hymns and prayers rising up to the rafters, but when Pastor Daniels stepped to the pulpit, his eyes found mine. He spoke of betrayal and forgiveness, of choices that test the bonds of family, and of the strength it takes to honor your parents, even when pride tempts you otherwise. Then he said it plain, his voice ringing clear. "We've all seen what happens when pride runs wild, but we've also seen what happens when a man refuses to bow to it. Harold Whitaker has reminded us all, honor thy father and thy mother, for without that a house cannot stand." The congregation turned, looking at me. Some nodded, others clapped softly. I bowed my head, my throat tight, Margaret's Bible warm in my hands. After the service, people came to shake my hand, to pat my shoulder, to say words like brave and strong. I didn't feel brave. I didn't feel strong. I felt tired. But I also felt whole in a way I hadn't for a long time. Walking home, I thought about the house waiting for me. It was old, creaking in places, the paint peeling in the back. But it stood. It had weathered storms, both of weather and of blood. And now it stood with me again. That evening, I settled once more onto the porch. The sun was slipping low, pouring gold through the branches of the old maple tree. The swing beside me creaked with the breeze, and for a moment I could almost hear Margaret's laughter echoing from years past. The street was quiet, except for the occasional bark of a dog or the hum of a car passing by. Children rode their bikes, their voices carrying down the block, and I thought of Ethan at their age, knees scraped, hair sweaty, smiling at me with a trust that seemed unbreakable then. Somewhere along the years, that bond had cracked, chipped away by pride and pressure until it finally split. I held the railing and looked out at the house, its windows catching the last light of day. This place had seen it all: the sacrifices, the betrayals, the verdict that returned it to me. But in the end, it wasn't just the walls or the roof that mattered. It was the lesson it carried. A house can be lost or regained. I knew that now more than ever. But once family ties are broken, no wall, no contract, no verdict can stitch them back together. The thought didn't come with bitterness. It came with a steady calm, a recognition of truth. Maybe one day Ethan would find his way back, maybe not. That was his path to walk. Mine was here, with the memories, the dignity, and the knowledge that I had not yielded when it mattered most. As the sun sank, painting the sky in deep purples, and Red's neighbors passed by and called their good nights, I nodded back, grateful but quiet. The weight I carried wasn't theirs to lift, but the respect in their voices eased it all the same. I sat until the stars began to prick through the dark. The house stood behind me, solid and still. The air was cool, and my eyes stung not with sorrow, but with the strange mix of relief and wisdom that comes only after surviving the fire. I whispered into the night, to Margaret, to myself, to whatever part of Ethan might still be listening somewhere out there. A house can be lost or regained, but once family ties are broken, no wall can hold them together. The words lingered in the air like a prayer, and I let the silence answer. The swing creaked gently. The porch light flickered on. My heart, though heavy, was steady, and in that quiet I finally understood justice had been done, but the greater gift was the lesson left behind. From this story, we can draw many profound lessons for life. First, family bonds are the true foundation, something money or status can never replace. When children put greed and pride above family, the result is only loss and brokenness. Second, the elderly are not always weak or resigned. They carry wisdom, dignity, and resilience forged through a lifetime, and when pushed to the edge, they can rise to protect their honor. Third, the community holds the power of a court of public opinion where moral justice can be served even when the law moves slowly. And finally, justice is not always about revenge, but about reminding the next generation of what truly matters. A house can be reclaimed, but once trust and family bonds are shattered, nothing can ever fully mend them. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box to the right.